Ambassador Eikenberry, thank you so much for being with us.
Sam, it's great to be here. Thank you.
You've had such a varied life and career, a lot of attention to the most recent phases of that, but I kind of want to go back to your formative years to start the conversation. Now, am I right that you matriculated into West Point in 1969?
That's right.
So just help me get into the mind of a young Karl Eikenberry. You know, this is the height of rancor over the Vietnam War. You're in high school when RFK Jr. is killed. You're in high school when Martin Luther King Jr. is killed. You're in West Point when the National Guard opens fire at Kent State. In a moment where the country is as divided as maybe it's ever been since the Civil War, where many see, the armed forces maybe as the enemy. Like, what is compelling you? What is going on in your mind that makes you seek out West Point and what a career in the armed services is offering?
Sam, contingency in life is so important, and all of us have our different blessings we have when we're growing up. For myself, as I look back on those years, several factors were important. First of all, my family, as I was growing up, we moved every couple of years. We moved as much as a military family. Not that we were in the military. My father was a very successful manager, production manager of factories, and looked at as a person who get things turned around. So all that moving around, all within the United States, it did make me much more prepared, I think, for changing environments, the need to be able to adapt, to fit in, look at different values. My mother and father themselves, huge influences on me. My mother, a very compassionate woman, taught me empathy, taught me how to listen. My father, a very good leader, very high standards. So the choice of West Point, there was contingency involved in that. I remember when I told my dad my list of 4 schools that I would like to consider was Harvard, Williams, Dartmouth, and West Point. He was quite surprised with West Point. He had World War II service. That was probably an influential factor in my decision. But when I got to West Point, I think with that foundation that I had, it was a moment in which, in that environment, now the aperture was suddenly wide open. A troubled nation, but still for myself and for Americans, a very good nation. And that sense then of responsibility taught early on about the national interest, the West Point values, duty, honor, country, all of that mattered. That said, Sam, yeah, it was challenging. I remember going on leave off of West Point to different campuses around the United States, and there was a feeling that you were a bit alien to all of this, but as we know, our country restored itself and healed itself.
What was it, was there an active discussion at West Point about the kinds of topics that, in retrospect, define the way we talk about this era, sort of the onset of a Vietnam syndrome, a withdrawing of the U.S. from the world, kind of questions about the application of force, or what were you talking about as young officer candidates who are going to have to lead this important part of not just our national security establishment, but this sort of the most visible projection of the United States into the world?
Well, Sam, that also is, for me, is a great question. My generation at West Point, say the classes of 1972, 73, 74, we arrive at West Point in 4 years before, and the Vietnam War is raging. Indeed, we think when we're going into West Point that probably we'll be serving in Vietnam. 1968 election, President Richard Nixon, the issue is Vietnam. We come out of Vietnam. So it's a long way of saying that my class of 1973, we did not serve in Vietnam. The end of combat had occurred by that point in time. So to answer your question, the impact, I would say professionally, on my class and the classes just before, the classes just after, was the influence by what was to be called the Never Again School. And who was the Never Again School? That was that group of Army officers, senior non-commissioned officers, who served in the Vietnam War and saw this 10 years of trial for the United States, for armed forces, leading in a defeat. And so the Never Again School was a group of officers, informal group of officers, that said we need to rebuild the United States military. And we need to also have an officer corps which is able to advise our senior civilian leaders so that when asked the questions about the application of military force for a particular contingency, can be straightforward with them. Say, here will be the cost, here will be the resources. We're going to need, because it will be a sustained campaign, you, Mr. President, need to be thinking about the support of the American people in the long term. And so that was a group of officers who probably people listening to us right now don't know many names of, but one would be, for instance, the late General Colin Powell. That group of officers then, as I'm a young officer looking at these 35-year-old majors and 40-year-old lieutenant colonels with the Vietnam service, that's their message to us. Rebuild the American military into a world-class fighting force, but also remember always your obligations as a senior military officer in your dialogue of providing best military advice to our civilian leaderships. Now, to bring this on to a later stage of my career, then there was a degree of irony, as we had been brought up with the Never Again school teaching us, and yet by the end of our careers, we were engaged in Iraq and Afghanistan. And some of those lessons that the Never Again school had taught my generation, it's as if we maybe should have heeded them better.
Did you? Well, let's stay there for a minute. I mean, I want to go back a little bit to the kind of the changing mission of the 80s and 90s, but let's stay there. What, bring us into your mind. You're leading Combined American Forces in Afghanistan, then you become ambassador. Like, is there a feeling we didn't learn the lesson? Is it that the situation is so different? Is it in some ways the lesson could never really be learned? Conflict is just a challenging, confusing, complex endeavor. What is going through your mind, given that your entry into the armed forces is this moment that you described as so transformational in the way that a whole generation thought about conflict?
Yeah, Sam, I think for myself and for some of my peers, the lesson was relearned perhaps that limited wars are very, very difficult for democracies to fight. Democracies are very good at mobilizing and fighting total war. So World War I, World War II.
Like we're all in it.
Yes, and we fight to the finish. Where the problems become, I think, for the open democracies is these limited wars where the objectives are not well defined. It's going to require a great degree of patience by the American people to see an outcome, a tendency perhaps to become over-optimistic and overreach in a case like Afghanistan, where, as you recall, after 9/11, we went into Afghanistan very narrowly to find bin Laden and destroy al-Qaeda. 5 years later, we're engaged in a huge nation-building project, which was overreach. So the lessons that come out of that is lessons of limited war. Be careful about the application of force. Before you decide to put force in, be thinking of what's your strategy to get that force back out again, and clearly defining what the political outcomes are that you're trying to achieve. Military force is in support of political objectives. If you put in military force and you don't have well-articulated political objectives, then the military campaign will take on a logic of its own. And that's what we did see in Afghanistan and Iraq, where huge application of military force, and without clear political objectives, then we just keep on fighting, but it's not clear what the end state's going to be.
I mean, so you entered college in 1969. I entered college in 2001, and I went to a school that started late. So 9/11 happened a week before I matriculated.
You're making me feel old, Sam.
Not my aim, not my aim. But I think, I remember, campuses are really divided right now, but. And so the level of division that we experienced when I was a student, this probably feels quaint compared to what we see now, but it did feel very divided. And in particular, it didn't take, unquestionably, 9/11 was seen as both a terrible tragedy and this incredible act of aggression, even though the enemy was less formed, than another nation state. But it didn't take long, certainly for other students on campus and other college campuses, to very quickly kind of project onto Afghanistan and then Iraq of what we experienced as a Vietnam or understood as a Vietnam-like reaction, right? That this wasn't about defending some liberal project. It was a kind of power projection. like what were we missing? Either what were we missing or what was going wrong in that process of communication that you've been describing with the
Yeah,
American people?
I think, Sam, that perhaps historians and political figures will look back at the aftermath of 9/11 and with great empathy understand why there was this very strong reaction from the Bush administration, indeed from the nation. Our homeland had been hit. The iconic World Trade Towers were down. I was in the Pentagon when the aircraft hit. And so there's a fear, there's a degree of controlled panic, and we have to strike back. I think that as we look back at that moment, there'll be a critique that perhaps we had overstated the threat. Not intentionally, but that if we had had a pause, said, well, the threat is out there, it's real, with a few defensive measures, improving airport security, we can do a lot with this. The campaign in Afghanistan clearly justified. We had to go after bin Laden. But I think that in terms of what followed then, why did the American people then for a period of time rally around the flag? Why did that start to break down? I think one is there was a realization by the American people that the threat was serious, but it was not existential. An existential threat like the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and with the political leaders out talking about it all the time, you can get a degree of national consensus. Interestingly, on a second point, that when President Bush stood up, for good reasons, said, be calm. The best thing you can do right now, Americans, is go get back to the shopping centers, spend money. That's not necessarily a rallying cry that's going to lead people to say that we're in a real big fight right now. The third point would be the characteristics of our armed forces. So during the Cold War and through the Vietnam War, we had a draft army. It's not an argument that we need to go back to a draft army, but we had a volunteer force, a 100% volunteer force after 9/11, in fact going back to the mid-1970s. And with that volunteer force, then the average American, they have no skin in the game, so to speak. So our forces are being fighting these expeditionary wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but the American people are really detached from it all.
So help us understand how you're thinking during this period. You in sequence lead our armed forces presence in Afghanistan, then effectively our civilian representation as ambassador. We're in a conflict that, as you're describing it, because of the kind of asymmetry between how we apply force and the nature of the conflict is quicksand. You've got an American public that probably started apathetic, is becoming antipathetic. What do you change during this period? Does your idea about the small questions, what we're here to do, change? Does your idea about the big questions, how America conducts itself in the world, does that change also?
It does change dramatically, and for those that have seen the movie Groundhog Day, where you have Bill Murray waking up every day and learning something new about his environment and about himself, and then the benefit of going back to sleep and having that wisdom to apply the next day. So for myself, with regard to Afghanistan, I was in the Pentagon when the plane hit on 9/11. A year later, I was serving my first tour of duty in Afghanistan as a Major General. I would go back several years later to command the coalition forces from 2005 to 7. I went to NATO headquarters in Brussels, Belgium for my penultimate military assignment as a Lieutenant General, and about 30% of my portfolio was Afghanistan. And then President Obama nominated me, and I was confirmed by the Senate to be his ambassador in Afghanistan from 2009 to 11. So many, many different looks at Afghanistan at very different times. And that's important because the threat that was in Afghanistan, the threat to the Afghan people, the threat to the world, that evolved over time. When we first went in after 9/11, Taliban was militarily defeated quickly. And so even the Afghan people in the early days, they were very optimistic. There was no limit to possibilities. It would be hard, money would be needed, but there was the notion that democracy was triumphant in the world and in those days, and that With a little bit of aid, with a little bit of security, with free and fair elections, they're on the way to Denmark eventually. By the next tour of duty,
Feels a little distant now. Denmark, yeah.
Quite distant, yeah.
Yeah.
2005 to 2007, I come back several years later, Taliban's reconstituted itself. Pakistan is now providing sanctuary for that reconstituted Taliban. And in addition to that, as problems are starting to mount in Afghanistan, a little bit to the west, we've got a huge war going on. It's called Iraq. During those days, I recall, Sam, apropos to this conversation, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mike Mullen, he was, I think, at the Council on Foreign Relations at a think tank and publicly talking about Iraq and Afghanistan. And he says famously, in Iraq, we do what we must. In Afghanistan, we do what we can. And so that juxtaposition of now our main effort is really Iraq. And then finally, as the ambassador, President Obama is now in office. He said we're going to do more in Afghanistan. We don't know how much more. The military plan that's presented to him is really just different options of a heavy long-term counterinsurgency approach. I think the president was skeptical of that approach, but was willing to give the military, to give our team about a year and a half. But by that point in time, now as the ambassador, having been through many, many different debates, having seen very many different approaches towards solving the problem, trying to bring peace and stability to the country, I too at this point in time had become quite skeptical.
What do you, and where do you think we are now? I mean, we're in a period where I think populism in politics, which tends to sort of go hand in hand with a kind of isolationism, is certainly resurgent. The war is not popular, not really seen as winnable, not even clear to people now for over a decade. A few years ago, we have a withdrawal that I think to some people who can remember has sort of shades of the helicopter taking off at the U.S. Embassy in Saigon.
Absolutely.
What's your feeling now looking back? You saw this from all these different sides. Clearly you had a required optimism that if we're going to be here, we're going to do what we can. A necessary skepticism about the limits of American power and about the limits of control in a necessarily complex situation. Where do you think we are now, and do you have a sense of an assessment of this pretty significant period of U.S. history?
Sam, your comparison to the moment of the helicopters off the Saigon embassy in 1975 is we're withdrawing, our final withdrawal from Vietnam, and how things ended in 2021 for us in Afghanistan. That's an apt comparison. To take that further, of course, there was the great debate that occurred then in the years following the defeat in Vietnam about whether United States' reputation was irrevocably now harmed, and that this would represent now the high point of the United States, and we would be in strategic decline since. I recall that debate. I was in uniform at the time, and America did get itself turned around. It was fascinating. By 1980, 1981, 82, by that point in time, there was no more talk about the Vietnam legacy. There was in terms of lessons learned for the United States, but in terms of foreign policy credibility, that seemed behind us.
So you had a president in Reagan who exemplified a kind of center-right hawkishness, though, who was willing, to your point earlier about civilian leaders, who was willing to speak in a strident and forceful way about our role and the importance of power projection in that role.
Yes, but he was also clear about where America's national interests were. And I think that the world concluded that going back to the Vietnam War, 10 years, 54,000 Americans killed in that war, $1 trillion of expenditures in that war, that the conclusion of the world, and more importantly the American people, was it was really an unnecessary war. Yeah. Was it a vital national interest at stake there? And it was a period of time where the Americans had so much capacity. The Soviet Union, a formidable military threat, but not an economic threat. We had formidable capacity at that point. And it's the risk in a democracy where with that excess capacity, you do things in foreign policy simply because you can do them. Had we had the world of today, would we have embarked on the Vietnam campaign? Had we had the world of today, would we have embarked on the 2003 invasion of Iraq? My thought is probably not.
Or it would have looked really different.
So in the case of Afghanistan, the withdrawal was horrible. It was horrible for the Afghan people. The images were horrible for us.
Yeah.
It was horrible for veterans. It was horrible for the entire world who looked at the United States as a friend and a partner and had doubts at that point in time. My belief, though, back to the question, Sam, what does all this mean? I believe now, at this point, it really has a lot more to do with our future foreign policy and the choices we make. I think most people would conclude it was a very tragic ending, but getting back to the starting point, was the United States making the proper investments in Afghanistan, given really what the stakes were at that time?
Yeah.
So going forward, how are we going to do in terms of state power competition, which is intense right now with our rivalry with China, with Russia, concerns with North Korea, concerns with Iran? A very different world than we had in the first decade of this century, where we felt we could narrowly focus on terrorist organizations and perhaps do things that were transformational to the Middle East.
I mean, let me ask you, I want to kind of end asking you about the future, because I think, one decade we didn't spend time on was the 90s.
Yeah.
And in some ways now, we're kind of living in the ashes of the the end of history idea that really economic liberalism in the former Soviet states and in East Asia would bring, if not liberal democracy, a degree of political liberalism, and would provide sort of a new way to great power peace. And of course, now we're in a world where we have an authoritarian leader in Russia who clearly is at least testing the limits of international resistance to changing borders by force. And we have sometimes rival, sometimes collaborator, or in China,
But a very autocratic system.
Very autocratic system that shows no signs, really, in fact, shows signs of political retrenchment.
Yeah.
So what do you, now not really being formally part of the national security establishment, having gone through kind of this incredible revolution in American doctrine, it feels on the one hand like we're right back where we were during the Cold War, but on the other hand, everything's changed. And there's a different, it all has a different kind of shade to it. Who do we need to be in this moment? We can't know what the choices are going to be, but you've reflected so much on being able to make the right choices. Like, who do we need to be to see the right choices over the next 10, 20 years?
Yeah, it's going to be a difficult way forward for us. The world that we live in now, where people say primarily a bipolar world, China and the United States, that's an overstatement. We have two very powerful countries, and truly, in certain categories, military, in terms of technology, future economic competition, these are the two poles. But beyond that, it's a much more multipolar world than we saw during the Cold War. I think what we find is that during the Cold War, this bipolar world, and then let's call from 1990, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, until maybe the next 15 years to maybe 2015, that's a primarily unipolar world, at least militarily. Certainly, it was a unipolar world. But if we look over the span of history, that seems to be an aberration, that the world has generally been much more multipolar. Certainly. So now we have this distribution of power. We have to look at the United States and China, but we have to look at the rest of the globe as well. And the challenge I think that we're facing, Sam, is, first of all, we have to look at the world as it is, and what are the attributes of competition going to be? And those attributes of competition with China are going to be very much economic competition, which is going to be high-tech and complex manufacturing driven.
Really kind of management of complex supply chains.
Yes, and extraordinarily difficult to take this one on. At the same time, recognizing that all these proliferating high technologies, to degrees we couldn't have imagined 50 years ago, have national security implications, if not for direct battlefield application, perhaps critical to our infrastructures.
No question.
So the tendency then of our national security community to look increasingly at everything that's out there on the shelf and saying that's got national security implications, which then means very, very difficult as we try to figure out how do we keep ourselves linked together with China and the rest of the world and not end up with creating a bipolar world. The final challenge we have here is that set of difficulties that we face aside. We talk about state-on-state competition, but the real existential problems are probably the transnational problems, the climate change issues, the pandemic change, the pandemic.
Just global coordination problems that are going to have national security implications.
And if we end up with a bifurcated world, then we are not going to be able to address those problems. So how do you compete, but find ways to take certain issue areas where not only can you have win-win, but you must have win-win if we're going to address these.
Well, Ambassador Eikenberry, that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, and thanks for this wonderful setting here.